Marcus Hale was 44 years old, and for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, he had been certain his wife was gone. Not gone in the way people use that word loosely, the way they mean distant or changed or emotionally unavailable. Gone in the documented, certified, legally processed way. Gone in the way that had a death certificate filed with the county clerk's office, a grave marker at Riverside Memorial Cemetery with her name cut into granite, and a folded flag that a funeral director had pressed into his hands as a gesture of sympathy, and that Marcus had accepted without thinking because he had been too hollowed out in that moment to consider whether it was appropriate. Gone in the way that leaves a man sitting in a house that still smells like someone else's shampoo for 4 months before he can bring himself to crack a window. He had believed it because he had been given every reason to believe it. The hospital had called him at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. He had driven the 18 miles to the hospital in 22 minutes, which was 7 minutes faster than the route should have allowed, and he had still arrived too late. The attending physician had met him in the family consultation room, a beige square of a space with a rubber plant in the corner that was either artificial or spectacularly neglected. The doctor had been patient, measured, and thorough. The accident had occurred at 11:22 the previous night on Route 9, a single vehicle collision, massive head trauma. They had done everything they could. Her dental records, obtained from her regular dentist, a Dr. Paulson who ran a small practice on Clement Street, had confirmed the identification. There had been no question, the doctor said, no room for ambiguity. Marcus had believed every word because the doctor had delivered it quietly, and quiet people in that room did not have any reason to lie. He had arranged the funeral himself. He had called her mother, Verna, in Phoenix, and that conversation had lasted 41 minutes, and most of it had been silence, the kind that two people hold across a telephone line because there is nothing in any available language that handles what has just happened. He had picked out the casket, a mid-range walnut model, because Diane had always considered excess a form of dishonesty. He had written the obituary and proofread it twice, and approved the flowers, and stood at the graveside on a gray November morning while a pastor read from a page Marcus had typed himself in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Their daughter Renata had been 11 years old. She had held his hand for the entire service without letting go, and she had not cried until the car ride home, and then she had cried for 20 minutes straight and fallen asleep against the window with her cheek on the glass, and Marcus had driven the rest of the way home without the radio on. He had gone back to work at the shipyard 10 days later because standing still felt like drowning, and he had a daughter to keep standing for. He was a structural welder by trade, lead welder now, 18 years at the yard, with a reputation for reading a seam the way other men read a face. His foreman, Doug Cheatham, had put him on light work for the first 3 weeks back, not because protocol required it, but because Doug was a decent man who understood that the body could be present while the mind was somewhere else entirely, and that those two states of being did not belong on the same scaffold. Marcus had accepted the light work without protest. By the 5th week, he had returned to the heavy frames, the work that asked everything of a person's physical attention and technical judgment, and he had been grateful for that, because sustained attention was the one thing grief could not survive. 3 years passed in the shape of that routine. Renata turned 12, then 13, then 14. She was in her sophomore year of high school now, sharp and self-contained in the manner of children who have had to grow up without being invited to. She had her mother's jaw, her mother's way of holding a room without performing for it, and her mother's habit of pressing her thumbnail against her front teeth when she was working through a thought. Marcus noticed that habit every time it surfaced and said nothing about it, because some things were not his to name. His own routine had a texture that held him. He woke at 5:10, made coffee in the same 12-cup pot that had been on the same counter for 11 years, drove the same route to the yard, worked his shift, drove home, made dinner, checked Renata's homework, even on the evenings she did not need him to. Before bed, he sat at the kitchen table for an hour with a paperback thriller he had bought at an airport kiosk the previous winter and had been stuck on page 214 of for 3 months. Something about page 214 put him to sleep without fail, and the book had become less a reading project than a reliable piece of equipment, something he reached for the way he reached for a specific wrench. He visited the grave on the 14th of every month, which had been the date of their wedding anniversary. He brought whatever the grocery store florist had in season. In November, chrysanthemums. In March, whatever was still holding on. He stood at the marker for 10 minutes, said what he needed to say in silence, and left. He was not performing. He was keeping the appointment, which was all grief ever really is once the acute part has passed. In the first week of March, Renata asked if they could drive south to the state aquarium. She had a project on marine ecosystems for her environmental studies class, and she wanted to take her own photographs rather than source them online. She mentioned this at breakfast on a Tuesday, in the casual register that 14-year-olds use for things they care about more than they want to admit, and Marcus looked at her thumbnail against her front tooth for half a second and said yes before she had finished explaining. They drove down on a Friday evening, checked into a 2-room suite at a mid-range hotel near the waterfront, ate at a diner Renata had looked up on her phone. She was asleep by 10. Marcus sat in the chair by the window with the thriller, made it to page 215 for the first time, and fell asleep there, with the book in his lap and the lamp still on. The aquarium opened at 9. They were there at 9:15, Renata with her camera and her small notebook, Marcus with 2 coffees from the hotel lobby. It was Saturday, and already filling with the weekend crowd, school groups and families moving in clusters past the tanks. Marcus stayed a half step behind, the way he always did in crowds, watching Renata work the jellyfish display for several minutes, the way she adjusted her angle twice before she took a single shot, the patience of it, the consideration. He was standing 40 feet from the tropical reef exhibit, holding both their coffees because Renata had handed him hers to free her hands, watching her and not much else, when something at the edge of his vision moved in a way that pulled his attention before he had consciously chosen to look. A woman standing near the edge of a large cylindrical tank on the far side of the room. She was looking up at the tank, not toward him. She wore a dark green jacket, and her hair was shorter than he remembered, cut just below the ear. And his brain began generating rational alternatives immediately, the way a trained mind does when it senses it is about to be destabilized. You are tired. You are in a strange city. You have been alone a long time, and that does things to people. The resemblance is not a match. It is a pattern your mind is projecting onto a stranger. Then she laughed. It was aimed at whoever stood beside her, a man Marcus had not yet examined, a soft social laugh at something that had been said, and the laugh broke slightly at the top, a small catch, barely a hitch, the kind of acoustic signature that belongs to one person and one person only. Marcus had heard that laugh in the dark for 3 years. He had heard the genetic residue of it in Renata's occasional laughter, and every time it had felt like pressing on a bruise. This was not pattern recognition. This was not projection. This was the specific, irreproducible laugh of his wife, and it was coming from a woman who had been dead for 3 years and 4 months. His hands did not shake. He noted this with the same detachment he brought to unexpected measurements on the yard floor. He set one coffee cup on the railing beside him. Careful, no sound. He looked at the woman again. She had turned slightly, and the left side of her jaw was visible now, and below her ear, just above the collar of the green jacket, was a small crescent-shaped scar, pale from years of fading but still present, the kind that time softens but does not erase. She had gotten that scar at 23, a pressure cooker lid that had come loose at the wrong angle, and Marcus had driven her to urgent care that night and held a folded cloth against it for 35 minutes in the waiting room, and she had complained about the wait the entire time. and he had told her she could file a formal grievance with the universe later. He took out his phone. He opened the camera. He steadied his hand, framed the shot at 2x, and took 6 photographs in 8 seconds while she was still turned toward the tank. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and picked up the coffee cup again. Renata appeared at his elbow and reached for her coffee without looking up from her notebook. "Dad, did you know reef sharks can detect 1 part of blood in approximately 1,000,000 parts of water?" "I did not," Marcus said. His voice was level. Renata wrote something and moved toward the next tank. What Marcus did in the weeks that followed would dismantle everything Diane Hale thought she had permanently left behind. Before we get into this story, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from right now. And subscribe, because the story we are posting tomorrow is one you absolutely cannot afford to miss. Marcus had met Diane Kolchik at a union fundraiser in the fall of 2004. He had been 27, she had been 25, and she had been standing near the edge of a room full of people she clearly knew, while managing to look like she was deciding whether any of them were worth the continued effort. He had found that instantly compelling. They had talked for 2 hours without noticing how much time had passed, and he had driven her home and they had stood on the stoop of her apartment building for another 40 minutes in the cold, because neither of them had wanted to be the one to call it a night. He had understood from early on that Diane was not an uncomplicated person. She was sharp and quick and capable of a cutting observation that she did not always intend to land as hard as it did. But she was also the person who, when Marcus's father had his first cardiac event in 2007, had driven to the hospital alone, identified herself to the nursing station as family, tracked down the cardiologist managing the case, and extracted a clear explanation of the treatment plan before Marcus had finished parking the car. She did things like that, efficient acts of ferocity aimed at the people she cared about. And Marcus had felt, for most of their marriage, that he was securely in that category. They had Renata in the spring of 2009. Diane had gone back to her job as a financial compliance coordinator at a regional bank at 12 weeks, which was earlier than her maternity leave allowed, and which her supervisor had, after a brief exchange of opinions, permitted. Marcus had adjusted his shifts at the yard to cover the coverage gap. They had made it work, the way working families make things work, with precision and no available margin for inefficiency. He had noticed changes in her during the last year before the accident. She had grown quieter in a specific way, not sad in a visible way, not withdrawn in a way he could point to and name, but contained, as if something that had previously run on the surface of her had moved deeper. He had asked about it twice, gently, choosing his moments, and both times she had told him she was fine and redirected the conversation, and both times he had believed her, because he had never been given reason not to. The accident had happened on a Tuesday night in November. She had attended a work event downtown and had texted him at 9:30 to say she was heading home. She had not come home. The police called at 6:47 the following morning. The officer had been patient and slow, in the way of someone who has delivered this kind of news before and has learned to respect how long it takes to land. He had confirmed the details twice: a single vehicle collision on Route 9 at 11:22 the previous night. Massive head trauma. The driver of a second vehicle, believed to have been involved, had left the scene and had never been identified. That open file had always sat with Marcus, a loose thread he had never found a way to pull, and which had eventually simply gone cold, the way cold cases did when the resources moved on. Her dental records from Dr. Paulson on Clement Street had confirmed the identification. The death certificate had been processed by the county within the standard window. Her mother, Verna, had flown in from Phoenix for the funeral and stayed a week. She had been devastated in the specific way of mothers who have outlived their worst fear, and Marcus had spent significant portions of that week alongside her grief, as well as his own. Her brother Carl had come for 2 days, formal and quiet, and had barely spoken. Marcus had not held that against him. People occupy grief differently, and silence is as legitimate as anything else. The life insurance policy paid out after 3 months, the standard review period for claims of that size. $67,000. He had placed half in a college account for Renata and put the rest in a savings account he had not touched. He was not sure why he had never touched it. It had felt wrong to spend it, some instinct he had not examined, which he now understood differently. He went back to the yard. Back to his seams and load tolerances, and the morning stop at Granger Street, where Ray at the counter had his order ready before Marcus reached the register. Back to page 214. Back to the routine that was not happiness, but was functional and present, and had held him together sufficiently to keep the machinery of a household running for a child who needed it to run. That was where 3 years of his life had gone. Until the aquarium. Until the laugh with the hitch at the top. He sat in the hotel room that night after Renata was asleep, and he reviewed the 6 photographs with the same methodical attention he gave to a stress fracture and hull plating. He examined each image region by region: the jaw, the profile, the ear, the collar line of the green jacket, and the margin of skin below the ear. The resolution was not perfect, but it was sufficient. In the 5th photograph, the woman had turned 3/4 toward the camera while looking at something across the room, and the scar was visible in 2 of the 6 frames, pale and crescent-shaped, and exactly where he had last seen it, in a hospital waiting room 21 years ago. He was not looking at a resemblance. He was not projecting. He was looking at Diane Hale, alive, standing in a public aquarium 3 hours from the house they had shared, with her hair cut differently and someone else's hand in hers. Marcus did not pace the room. He did not open the minibar. He sat in the chair by the window with his hands folded on his knees, and he thought about what a welder does when the material in front of him behaves in a way the specification says is impossible. You do not argue with the material. You do not insist the specification must be right. You document what you are observing. You run the test again from baseline. You build your understanding forward from what the evidence confirms, not from what you had previously assumed was true. He found Gideon Park's contact and typed a message. Gideon had worked at the yard for 6 years before leaving to join a private investigation firm, the legitimate kind. The kind that handled insurance fraud and corporate compliance and the occasional family matter. Marcus had always trusted Gideon without having needed to test that trust before. He typed, "Need to speak privately. Not urgent tonight, but it matters. Call when you can." He sent it. He set the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about the rubber plant in the consultation room. He thought about 41 minutes of silence on a phone call to Phoenix. He thought about Renata, asleep 11 feet away in the next room, her camera bag on the floor beside the bed. He did not sleep before the drive home. Gideon called on Monday morning during the shift break, and Marcus called on Monday morning during the shift break, and Marcus walked to the far end of the parking lot and spoke to him for 22 minutes. He described what he had seen. He described the scar. He sent the photographs while they were still connected. Gideon looked at them on his end and went quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Marcus, I need 2 weeks to do this right. You need to let me do it right." Marcus said he understood that. He understood it the way he understood the correct sequence for a high-load weld. Rushing changed the result, and the result was what mattered. He went back to the yard and ran his shift and made dinner and checked Renata's homework on a history essay that did not need checking, and sat with the thriller and made it to page 218 before the kitchen light and the quiet and the weight of 3 years of sitting at this table with this book put him down. On the 12th day, Gideon sent a file to Marcus's personal email. Marcus opened it in the truck in the parking lot before driving home, engine idling, the yard gate visible through the windshield. The file ran 12 pages with a 3-sentence covering note from Gideon. She is alive. Her current name is Dana Holt, I have addresses, employment records, and recent photographs. Read the complete file before you call me." Marcus read the complete file. Her name, by every document currently in circulation, was Dana Holt. She held a valid California driver's license under that name. She worked as a financial consultant at a mid-sized wealth management firm in a coastal city 60 miles south of the aquarium. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a building with a parking structure and a fitness center. She had a credit file showing 3 years of clean payment history on a car loan and 2 credit cards. She had a social media profile, private-facing, but with a profile image that Gideon had captured through a mutual connections feed, and the image confirmed everything the aquarium photographs had already told Marcus. The name Dana Holt. 3 years and 4 months of a built life. Clean credit, steady employment, a current address, a professional profile. Marcus sat in the parking lot for 9 minutes. Then he called Gideon. "The name is new," he said. It was not a question. 3 years and 4 months old, Gideon said. The identity was first established approximately 6 weeks before the accident. Credit file opened, employment records started, an online footprint beginning. She was laying groundwork. "The actual name," Marcus said. "Dana Holt. Is it real?" Gideon paused briefly. Last 3 pages of the file. Marcus looked down at his phone and navigated back to the file and went to the last section, which he had read quickly the first time. Dana Holt had been born in 1978 in a small rural county in Oregon. She had died in 2019 at 41 years old. Cause of death? Pulmonary embolism. No surviving immediate family. She was buried in a county cemetery. Her Social Security number, which appeared on the current California driver's license held by the woman Marcus had seen at the aquarium, belonged to a woman who had been in the ground for 4 years before that license was applied for. Marcus read the paragraph a second time. "She used a dead woman's identity," he said. "Yes," Gideon said. "That is not improvised." "No," Gideon said. "Someone had to research Dana Holt specifically. Find a candidate with no living immediate family, no spouse, no children, minimal social profile. Someone whose absence from public life would not generate a discrepancy. Then pull enough identifying documentation to satisfy the application requirements. That kind of research runs at minimum 6 months. Most cases I have seen, closer to a year." Marcus thought about the last year before the accident, the new quietness in Diane. The way she had become contained while living in the same house, while eating dinner at the same table, while attending the same school events and maintaining the same surface life. Underground. She had gone underground while appearing to remain exactly where she was. "I need one more piece," Marcus said. "The dental records. The ones filed at the time of the identification." "Already in process," Gideon said. Marcus drove home, made dinner. Sat with Renata through a homework question about the French Revolution that she resolved herself before he could contribute anything useful. Said goodnight at the normal time, loaded the dishwasher. Sat in the kitchen. He had begun a folder on his laptop, organized by date and category, with printed copies in triplicate, 2 sets in an envelope in the back of his desk drawer. He pulled it up now and added the new information from Gideon's file, tagging each item with its source and the date it had been confirmed. He had bought a blue folder at the office supply store to hold the printed copies, a random choice off the shelf, but it had become the object around which all of this was organized, and he carried it with him from this point forward. The yard did not notice anything different. His seams were clean, his measurements were within tolerance. Doug Cheatham complimented the inspection work on a whole section that had required full reevaluation. Marcus said thank you and moved to the next task. 3 days later, Gideon called at 7:20 in the morning. Marcus was at the gas station on Granger Street. Ray had already set the coffee on the counter, and Marcus had slid the exact change across before Gideon's name appeared on the screen. He stepped outside and answered. "Dr. Paulson," Gideon said. her dentist. Retired 14 months ago, Scottsdale. Before retirement, the state licensing board opened a review on a complaint filed by a former patient. Unrelated matter, billing dispute. But during the review, irregularities were noted in his record-keeping practices, specifically in documentation he had provided in 2 prior cases involving legal and insurance contexts. The board found insufficient evidence to act, but issued a formal letter of concern and required completion of an ethics remediation course. He completed the course and submitted retirement notice 2 months later. Marcus drank his coffee. A truck pulled out of the lot, and he watched it turn north. The dental records he filed were manufactured, he said. I cannot state that conclusion from what I have, Gideon said. What I can tell you is that the letter of concern is a public document that will appear on a license lookup, and that the board complaint was filed in December of the same year he submitted the records that confirmed the identification, which was approximately 1 month after he submitted them. Whether those 2 facts are connected is an argument for an attorney to make. Marcus thought about the careful, patient doctor in the beige room, the rubber plant, the measured delivery of an impossible sentence. He had believed the doctor because the doctor was calm, and calm people in that room were telling the truth. He had believed the dental records because they came from a licensed professional. He had believed all of it because it had been arranged specifically so that a reasonable person in his position would believe all of it. That was what preparation accomplished. It did not shout. It built a room and held the door open and let the evidence walk you in. Add it to the file, he said. Renata's 15th birthday was in 6 days. He had already purchased her camera, a mirrorless model with a solid kit lens, because she was genuinely serious about the photography, and serious things deserve the right tools. He was not going to bring any of this into her birthday week. He had made that decision in the hotel parking lot the night he first read the file, and he was holding it. She invited 2 friends on Saturday. Marcus grilled chicken and made a rice dish she liked, and stayed mostly out of the way while the 3 of them watched a movie in the living room that he did not follow from the kitchen. He sat afterward with the thriller and reached page 231. The second file from Gideon arrived 9 days after her birthday. Marcus was at the kitchen table with morning coffee when it came through. He read it straight. The man in the aquarium, the man whose hand Diane had been holding, was named Theodore Birch. He was 49 years old. He worked as a commercial real estate developer for a regional firm with offices in 2 coastal cities. His professional record was clean, his business filings were current and properly maintained. He had no criminal history. He had a reputation, confirmed by 3 separate professional contacts Gideon had spoken with, for being reliable and fair in a field not always associated with either of those qualities. He and Dana Holt had been together for approximately 26 months. They were engaged. The engagement had been announced 7 weeks prior on Theodore Birch's professional social media page, which was publicly visible. Gideon had captured a screenshot of the announcement and included it in the file. The photograph showed the 2 of them at a restaurant, her face clearly visible, her hair grown a few inches longer but the same cut, her hand on the table, Theodore's hand next to hers. The caption described his happiness in simple, specific terms. There was a wedding date. Marcus read it twice. 11 weeks from the coming Saturday, he called Gideon and said, "Where is the venue?" "Already running it down," Gideon said. "And I need an attorney, fraud and family law." "I have a name. She is very good." Her name was Patricia Voss. She had an office in a professional building 8 blocks from the county courthouse, up a flight of stairs, a corner unit with filing cabinets along one wall, and a window that looked over the parking structure. Marcus drove there on a Wednesday afternoon and laid out the contents of the blue folder across her desk, working through it in the order he had organized it, category by category, the way he would walk a supervisor through the findings of an inspection that had uncovered something structural. Patricia Voss listened without expression and without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for approximately 10 seconds, looking at the documents arranged in front of her. Then she said, "The marriage is still valid." I understood that to be the case. Your marriage to Diane Hale was never legally dissolved. The death certificate is a fraudulent document, which means no legal dissolution of the marriage has occurred. She remains your legal wife. Any subsequent marriage she enters into without first obtaining a valid divorce would constitute bigamy under state law, which is a criminal offense. Marcus nodded. The insurance claim, she continued, was paid on the basis of that fraudulent death certificate, supported by what appears to be falsified dental records provided by a licensed practitioner. That is insurance fraud. The insurer's legal team will have views on that. In parallel, the use of a deceased individual's social security number and identity to obtain government-issued identification constitutes federal identity theft. The exposure here is significant. She gathered the edges of the papers into alignment and looked at him directly. Marcus, you have enough here to end everything she has built, through entirely proper and entirely legitimate channels. He said, I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in the truth being on the record. Patricia Voss looked at him for a moment and said, in cases like this, those are the same objective. They simply arrive at the same place through different doors. He drove home and stopped at Granger Street, and Ray handed him a second coffee of the day without being asked because it was that kind of afternoon, and Marcus left $3 in the tip jar. There was one more thing he needed to establish before the confrontation could be staged correctly. He needed to know whether anyone in his trusted circle had known. He had been thinking about Carl since the first file. Carl, who had come to the funeral and spoken almost nothing and stood formally at the grave and left after 2 days. Marcus had attributed that at the time to grief taking a closed-up form. He understood it differently now. Carl Kowalczyk lived 40 minutes north and worked in property management. He and Marcus had maintained a cordial, infrequent relationship since the funeral, the kind that involved a text at major holidays and very little else. Marcus had always taken that distance as the natural pull away that follows when a family loses the connective member. He now had a different hypothesis about its origin. He did not call Carl in advance. He drove north on a Thursday evening after his shift, arrived at Carl's house at 6:45, and knocked. Carl answered in a worn t-shirt and looked at Marcus with an expression that Marcus clocked immediately as something other than genuine surprise. Not quite recognition, but not the open face of a man who has not been expecting a version of this moment. Marcus accepted a glass of water he did not drink. He sat at Carl's kitchen table. He took one photograph from the blue folder, the 5th aquarium image, the clearest profile with the scar in frame, and he placed it face up on the table between them. He said nothing. He watched Carl look at the photograph. Carl's face did not move. That was the full confession. If Carl had truly believed for 3 years that his sister was in a grave at Riverside Memorial, the photograph of her alive and standing in a public aquarium would have produced something visible, some rupture in the face, some sound. The specific disorientation of a person whose world has reorganized without warning. A man who genuinely did not know would ask a question. He would say, "That is not possible." He would reach for the photograph. Carl looked at the photograph for what measured out to 31 seconds. Then he set it down and looked at the table between them. "How long did you know?" Marcus asked. Carl did not say, "What do you mean?" He did not say, "That can't be her." He said, after a silence that lasted the length of a long exhale, "She called me 2 weeks before." Marcus thought about Renata's hand in his, at the grave in November rain, age 11. He thought about 41 minutes of phone silence with Verna in Phoenix. He did not raise his voice. He picked up the photograph and returned it to the blue folder. He stood. "She held my hand at that grave, Carl," he said. "Your niece held my hand at that grave." Carl looked up. He opened his mouth, And Marcus turned and walked to the front door and let himself out, and did not look back. He sat in the truck outside Carl's house for 6 minutes with his hands on the steering wheel. A dog somewhere down the block was barking at something it could not see. The streetlight above the truck had a flicker in it, on and off every few seconds. He had not cried once since the aquarium. Not in the hotel room, not reading the files, not in Patricia Voss's office. He sat in the truck for 6 minutes and felt something move through him that was neither grief nor rage, but the particular weight of a person who has discovered that the perimeter they thought they had been living inside was never where they believed it to be. That the security of an ordinary life can be engineered against you by more than one hand, and that sometimes the second hand is the one you thought was holding yours. He drove home. He checked in on Renata, who was at her desk doing something on her laptop. He made tea he did not drink. He went to bed. In the morning, he called Patricia Voss and added Carl's information to the file. She received it without visible reaction and noted that it likely added a civil dimension to the matter, but that the criminal exposure through the primary channels was already more than sufficient. One more task remained before the confrontation. He needed to confirm Theodore Birch in person, not to speak to him, not to warn him prematurely or disrupt his equilibrium before the right moment, but to look at him as a person and not as a name on a document, to make the confirmation that this was a decent man who deserved accurate information about his own life and not a co-architect of what had been done. Gideon had found a commercial real estate industry networking breakfast held monthly at a downtown hotel, listed publicly on an industry association website, registration open to new members at $40 per attendee. Marcus registered under his own name and drove downtown on a Thursday morning and arrived at 7:45. Theodore Birch was easy to find. He was the kind of man who occupied a room without commanding it, who worked the crowd with full attention rather than performance. Marcus watched him for 15 minutes from across the room, holding a coffee he barely sipped. Theodore listened when the person across from him spoke. He did not check his phone. He laughed at things that were actually worth laughing at. He introduced someone he did not know to someone else he knew better. That specific small act of social generosity that is either genuine or practiced. And on Theodore Birch, it read as genuine. Marcus had spent 17 years reading materials for structural integrity, and he knew the difference between load-bearing and deck rev. This man had no idea what was standing 3 weeks in front of him. Marcus set his cup on a table and left before anyone introduced themselves to him. He did not need anything else from the event. He had come to confirm one thing, and it was confirmed. He drove to the yard and worked the rest of the morning with his full attention on the hull section in front of him. On the way to the parking garage after the breakfast, he had done the math he had been avoiding. Gideon had established the Dana Holt identity as beginning 6 weeks before the accident. The research to identify a suitable deceased candidate, low social profile, no immediate family, sufficient identifying records available, ran a minimum of 6 months. The arrangement with Dr. Paulson, if that arrangement existed as the circumstances strongly suggested, required time, conversation, and compensation. The financial logistics of engineering a disappearance and leaving behind a legitimate-looking insurance claim required planning and calculation. The planning had begun, conservatively estimated, between 10 and 14 months before November. Renata had been 10 years old. Diane had looked at her 10-year-old daughter and continued with the research. Marcus started the engine and drove home and said nothing to anyone. He picked up Renata from school that afternoon, arriving early, watching her come out with 2 friends, talking, backpack on one shoulder, and when she spotted him, she jogged over with the particular mix of mild surprise and mild pleasure that a 15-year-old will not openly display. They went to the diner she liked. She ordered what she always ordered and told him about a documentary she had watched in class and the argument it was making and whether she thought it had cherry-picked its evidence base, and he listened to the logic of her thinking and felt something that sat alongside everything else, specific and clean and uncomplicated. which was pride. He told her the truth that evening. Not everything. The right amount. He told her that her mother was alive, that he had documentation to confirm it, that he was processing it through proper channels. He told her there would be a process, and it would be real and fair and concluded. He told her she had done nothing wrong and had never done anything wrong. He told her the loss she had lived with for 3 years was real, even if its stated cause was not. Renata sat across the kitchen table and did not cry. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether Marcus was okay. He told her he was getting there. The second was whether she could be present when the confrontation happened. He told her he would think about it. She went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the thriller to page 231 and read for 40 minutes and fell asleep. In the morning, she came to breakfast and said, "I want to be there." He poured her orange juice. He said, "I know." "I'm not asking to say anything," she said. "I just need to be in the room when it happens." He looked at her. The jaw. The thumbnail dropping away from her front tooth as her hand lowered. He said, "Then you'll be in the room." There were 5 weeks until the wedding date. Patricia Voss spent those 5 weeks filing the appropriate documentation with the appropriate offices. The insurance company received Gideon's file and the legal summary and opened a formal fraud investigation within 48 hours. The matter of Dr. Paulson's records was referred to the state licensing authority. The federal identity matter, the Dana Holt Social Security number, was referred to the appropriate federal office, which operated on its own timeline. All of it was in motion. Proper channels, moving forward, building the case in the way that legal processes build cases, methodically, with documentation, without drama. But there was a confrontation to stage, and it needed to be staged correctly, because Diane Hale needed to be known, not for the legal outcome, which was already secured, but for the accounting. For the moment when the constructed version of her life, Dana Holt's life, the clean apartment and the engaged man and the wealth management clients and the 3 years of careful distance from everything she had left behind, would have to stand in a room with the thing it had left. Gideon located the wedding venue. It was an event space on the waterfront in the coastal city, the same city where she had been living. The venue held tours for prospective clients on selected Saturdays, by appointment, open to the public. Marcus called on a Wednesday and booked the 11:30 slot for the following Saturday, 9 days before the scheduled wedding date. He gave his name, his actual name, Marcus Hale. He wore the dark navy jacket he had purchased for Renata's 8th grade award ceremony. He drove south. Renata sat in the passenger seat with her camera bag in her lap, not because she planned to take photographs, but because the bag was the object she carried when she needed to feel like herself. They arrived at the venue at 11:15. A coordinator named Betrayal met them at the entrance with sparkling water and a warmth that was professional and genuine simultaneously, the best kind. She walked them through the ground floor, and Marcus asked the kinds of questions prospective clients asked, which he had looked up, and Betrayal answered them with the practiced fluency of someone who had answered them hundreds of times without being bored by it. The main event space faced the water through long windows. It was a beautiful room. Marcus noted this without irony. Betrayal mentioned, while they stood near the windows, that another couple was finishing their consultation upstairs and would be coming down shortly. Marcus said, of course, no rush. He stood near the center of the room with his hands in his jacket pockets. Renata stood 2 steps to his right, camera bag on one shoulder, looking at the water through the windows. Her face was controlled in a way that was entirely his face. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Then he heard a half note of laughter, the small social release of a woman at ease in a moment of happiness, and the laugh broke slightly at the top, and Marcus did not move. Diane Hale, carrying the name Dana Holt, came around the foot of the staircase with Theodore Birch beside her. She was 2 steps into the room when she looked up and found Marcus standing in the center of it. and the identity she had built across 3 years and 4 months collapsed in the space of approximately 1 second. The color did not drain from her face gradually. It left all at once, as if the mechanism behind it had simply switched off. The ease, the warmth, the social texture of a woman at the center of a life she had arranged around herself, all of it ceased functioning simultaneously, and what remained was something very old and very afraid, standing inside a green jacket. She did not speak. She did not move. Theodore looked from her to Marcus with the brow-drawn confusion of a man who has not been given enough information yet. Marcus let 2 full seconds of silence hold. Then he said, in the voice he used on the yard floor, level and without elevation, "My name is Marcus Hale. I am her husband. She faked her own death 3 years and 4 months ago, and I have documentation confirming everything." Diane said, "Marcus." Just his name, more exhaled than spoken. "I am not here to make a scene," he said. "I am here because you are about to permit this man to enter into a marriage that is not legally possible, and he is owed the truth before that occurs." Theodore had gone very still. His hand had dropped from Diane's. He was looking at Marcus with the attention of a man whose mind is working to reorganize a very large amount of information very quickly. Diane looked briefly at Theodore and then back at Marcus. "You never would have understood," she said. "I understand all of it," Marcus said. "I have a file." He placed the blue folder on the nearest table. He did not open it. "I understand the Dana Holt identity, built 6 weeks before the accident on the records of a dead woman in Oregon. I understand Dr. Paulson and the letter of concern on his licensing record and the timing of that complaint. I understand the insurance fraud, which the insurer's legal team is currently investigating. I understand the federal identity matter, which is also in process. I understand that Carl knew 2 weeks before you disappeared because you called him." He let that settle for a moment. "And Renata is here because she asked to be." Diane's eyes moved to Renata for the first time. Renata was standing 2 steps to Marcus's right, camera bag on her shoulder, looking at her mother with an expression that was not rage and was not grief, but was the clear, flat, composed recognition of a person who has been given an accurate fact and has decided to hold it without flinching. "Renata," Diane said, the same way she had said Marcus, just the name, an exhalation. Renata did not answer. Theodore said in a careful, contained voice, "I need to understand what is happening here. You have been deceived in exactly the way I was, and you did not deserve it. That is the whole of my opinion on your situation. Everything supporting that statement is in the folder." Theodore looked at Diane. He had the face of a man who understands, without yet having the full explanation, that the reorganization his understanding is undergoing is going to take considerably longer than the next few minutes, and that the life he thought he was 9 days from beginning is not the life that exists. Diane said, "What we had was never enough. I needed to know there was something else possible." Marcus looked at her for a moment. He thought about page 214 of a paperback thriller, lying face down on a kitchen table at midnight for 3 months. He thought about chrysanthemums on the 14th of every month, whatever the season had available. He thought about a girl, 10 years old, sitting at this woman's kitchen table while this woman was already planning how to leave. He said, "You did what you wanted to do." He picked up the blue folder from the table. He said to Betrayal, who had not moved from the edge of the room and whose expression had achieved an impressive professional neutrality, "I apologize for the interruption. We won't be continuing the tour." He nodded once to Theodore, who returned the nod with the mechanical courtesy of a decent man on autopilot. He walked to the staircase, and Renata moved alongside him. They went down the stairs together and through the front entrance and out into the cold, flat light coming off the water. They walked to the car without speaking. Marcus unlocked it. Renata got in. He got in. He put the blue folder on the back seat and started the engine and pulled out of the lot. They drove north. The coastline ran alongside them for the first 30 miles, flat gray water under a low sky. After a long stretch of quiet, Renata said, "She looked smaller." "Yes," Marcus said. "I expected her to look bigger somehow, like the size of what she did." "People usually don't," he said. They drove in silence through the next several miles. Renata reached into her camera bag and found a granola bar and ate it and looked out her window. After 40 miles, she said, "Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm okay." He looked at her for a moment, then back at the road. "I know." She nodded. She put her earbuds in and leaned her head back against the window and closed her eyes. And Marcus drove north with the blue folder on the back seat and the particular stillness of something that has finally, after a very long time, been completed. The insurance fraud investigation resolved 14 weeks after the confrontation. The insurer's legal team, working from the documentation Patricia Voss had submitted, determined that the claim had been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation and filed for civil recovery with penalties. Patricia Voss filed the parallel action on Marcus's behalf. The federal identity matter moved on its own slower timeline, as federal matters do, but it moved. The state licensing board, receiving the referral on Dr. Paulson, opened a formal reinvestigation. 6 weeks after the referral, the public record on his license reflected the open investigation. Whatever he had agreed to 3 years and 4 months ago had not aged into safety. The wedding did not occur. Gideon confirmed this through an absence. The venue's social media account had announced several weddings that spring and announced nothing on the date that had been scheduled. Theodore Birch's professional page, which had carried the engagement announcement, carried no wedding announcement. The engagement post had been removed. Marcus thought about Theodore in the weeks after the confrontation, more than once. He thought about the particular stillness of a decent man absorbing information that reorders everything he thought was true. Marcus knew that stillness. He had lived inside it for 3 years. He hoped Theodore would land on the other side of it intact. He believed he would, because a man who listens when people speak and does not check his phone and introduces strangers to people who can help them tends to have the structural integrity to bear weight. Carl did not call. Marcus had not expected him to. He sent one brief message to Verna in Phoenix, not explaining the details, saying only that there had been a significant development in the circumstances of her daughter's case that she would likely learn about through other channels, and that Renata was doing well and was a genuinely remarkable person. Verna replied with a message that was 8 words long, and that told Marcus, between those 8 words, that she had suspected something was not right for a long time and had chosen not to ask. He filed that. He moved on. Renata had started seeing a counselor, a woman she had found herself from a referral list, who she saw on Thursday afternoons. She did not report extensively on the sessions, which was correct. She continued her photography on weekends and was building a series, images organized by a logic she was developing, and she had spread 4 of them on the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, and they were genuinely good, composed with intent, the work of someone who was learning to see. Marcus told her this directly. She received it with the careful restraint of a person who wants to believe what they are being told, but does not want to accept it too quickly. On the 14th of April, Marcus did not go to the grave. He did not go in May either. In June, he drove to Riverside Memorial alone and stood at the marker for 20 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than he had ever stood there before. He was not sure what he owed the marker now, what it meant to stand at a stone that represented an event that had not occurred. It represented the money he had spent on a casket. It represented the borrowed words of a pastor. It represented the proof of a sustained and detailed lie. He stood there for 20 minutes and then drove home. He sat in the kitchen that night and opened the paperback thriller to page 231 and read for 3 hours and 40 minutes without falling asleep once. And he finished the book and set it on the table and sat in the kitchen in the quiet for a while. He put it on the shelf in the hallway where he kept books he had read, and he went to bed, and he slept through the night without interruption for the first time in 3 years and 2 months. In October, Renata placed first in a regional photography competition for high school students. The winning image was a shot through the main tank at the state aquarium, taken on the return visit she had arranged herself and mentioned to Marcus only afterward. It was a photograph of a reef shark, 6 feet below the surface, its body a gray curve against the deep blue distance of the water. The judge's citation noted that the image demonstrated a mature understanding of negative space, by which the judge meant that what was absent from the frame carried as much weight as what was in it. Marcus read the citation twice. He put it on the refrigerator with a magnet that had been there since Renata was in the 4th grade, a watermelon slice magnet she had brought home from a field trip, and that had survived every cleaning, every grocery list, every permission slip that had been held to that door in the years since. He stood in the kitchen with his morning coffee and looked at the citation and the winning image printed beneath it and the watermelon magnet above it, and thought about what it meant to carry a weight for a long time and then to set it down, and to find that you are still standing, and that what is standing has not been fundamentally diminished by what it carried. He drove to work. He stopped at Granger Street, and Ray had the coffee on the counter before Marcus reached the register. "Morning," Marcus said. "Morning," Ray said. "Anything else today?" "No," Marcus said. "This is plenty." He left $2 in the tip jar and walked to his truck and drove to the yard. And the morning was cold and bright, and the work was waiting. And the work was exactly what he needed. The last thing Diane Hale had said to him in that room on the waterfront was that what they had been to each other was never enough, and that she had needed to know something else was possible for her. What she had never found in 3 years of building a borrowed name and a curated life and a man who believed her entirely was that enough was not a feeling a situation produced. Enough was a decision a person made about the life actually in front of them. Renata had understood that at 11 years old, holding her father's hand at a graveside in the November rain. Her mother had not learned it at 45, standing in a green jacket, holding a name that was not hers. There was one detail Marcus returned to in the months after it was over, not obsessively, but honestly, the way a person returns to the load calculation that almost failed and asks themselves what they would have done differently and whether the structure had been sound enough to begin with. He returned to the year before the accident. He returned to the quietness he had noticed in Diane and asked about twice and been told was nothing and had accepted as nothing. He was a man who read materials for hidden stress. He had spent 17 years learning that a fracture announces itself in small ways before it opens fully, that the surface of something can be entirely clean while the interior has already begun to separate, that the most catastrophic failures are always, in retrospect, preceded by signals that a trained eye would have caught and an untrained one would have missed. He did not punish himself for having had an untrained eye where his own marriage was concerned. He had not been her structural inspector. He had been her husband. Those were different relationships with different sight lines, and confusing them would have been its own kind of error. What he concluded, after the returning and the honest assessment, was that he had been sound, that the structure of the life he had built and maintained and carried and offered had been sound. The fracture had not originated in the foundation he had laid. It had been introduced from the outside by someone who had decided, before the evidence was in, that the structure was not worth staying inside. That was not a conclusion he needed to share with anyone. He held it privately, the way he held most things that were true and necessary, and not anyone else's business. Renata's counselor, at some point in the fall, apparently asked her to write something about the experience. And Renata had written something. And the counselor had mentioned to Marcus at a brief parent check-in that the writing demonstrated a maturity of processing that was uncommon for her age. Marcus had said thank you and asked if there was anything Renata needed from him. The counselor had said Renata seemed to need very little from the outside, and that this was both a strength and something to keep an eye on. Marcus drove home from that meeting and made dinner and set it on the table. And when Renata sat down, he said, "You know, you can tell me things." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Not just the okay ones." She thought about that for a moment, her thumbnail touching her front tooth once and then dropping. "I know, Dad," she said, more gently. And that gentleness was the whole of the answer. He passed the salt without being asked, and they ate, and she told him about an essay she was revising and the argument she was tightening. And he listened and offered one suggestion she considered and then rejected. And she was right to reject it, and he told her so. In November, on the 14th, Marcus drove to a state park 40 minutes north instead of to Riverside Memorial. He walked a trail for an hour, alone, in the cold that came off the trees, and he thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, which is what a cleared mind does when it is finally allowed to move at its own pace. He brought coffee in a thermos and drank it on a bench that faced a creek, and a dog appeared at some point and sniffed at his boot, and he scratched it behind the ears, and it moved on. He did not bring flowers. He did not say anything in his head to anyone who was not there. He sat on the bench until the coffee was gone, and then he walked back to the truck and drove home. He had an idea on that drive that the 14th of every month might gradually become something different now. Not immediately, not through a decision, but through the natural process by which objects and habits that were anchored to one meaning slowly, over time, come loose from it and begin to mean something else, or nothing at all. He was in no hurry. He had learned in the past year that hurrying the process of understanding something was a way of misunderstanding it, and that the most accurate assessments were the ones that had been allowed to develop at their own pace. Renata had her driver's license by the following spring, and on the first Saturday after she passed her test, she drove herself to the aquarium alone, a 3-hour round trip, and came home with 40 photographs she spent the rest of the day reviewing on her laptop. She showed Marcus 6 of them over dinner, without preamble, just turning the laptop to face him. They were all of water, different depths and different light, and the best one was nearly abstract, a surface shot where the light was hitting the water at an angle that made the texture of it look like a material rather than a liquid. He asked if she was developing a thesis for the series. She thought about it. "Something about what's underneath not being visible from the surface," she said. "But I don't want it to be about that literally. I want it to just be in there." He looked at the photographs again. "It is already in there," he said. She turned the laptop back and looked at them for a while longer before closing it. He finished his dinner and thought that the best thing about the work his daughter was doing was that she had decided to keep returning to the place where the thing happened, not to resolve it or to perform resolution, but to keep looking at it until she had made something true out of it. He did not know if she was aware of that. It did not matter whether she was aware of it. He washed the dishes, he dried them, he put them away. He sat at the kitchen table and opened a new book, a different thriller, also bought at an airport, and he read 50 pages before bed and set it on the nightstand and turned out the light and slept.